All right. Good morning, everybody. So welcome again to the Module 5 of the DEI learning trajectory. And this session is on racial justice in diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Today, actually, and the whole module is co-hosted by the Racial Equity Index, specifically Uma Mishra-Newbery. Welcome and thank you for being here with us. We've been looking forward to this session for a while. As we all know, the topic of racial justice in international development cooperation, as well as in diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a very relevant topic that we all feel we want to touch upon, but at the same time are struggling with to actually integrate that within our practice. We've been having various conversations before on this topic, and I've always seen a very large interest, but at the same time, when it comes to a follow-up, there are not really a lot of concrete initiatives that show how racial justice and racial equity can actually be integrated in your organization, and actually to see an accountability and a very large commitment towards this topic. So I'm very happy that we can invite the Racial Equity Index for this module to basically dive into this topic with us and actually start real commitment as an organization and individuals within your organization. So what to expect and what core needs have been identified before when we co-created this learning trajectory. It was first of all linked to interrogating our colonial history in the development sector. So understanding that link, as well understanding and dismantling the white gaze and racism within organizations. That also comes with understanding white privilege, and at the same time understanding how racism is surfacing in your organization, which is linking to the last part, to interrogate the structures in the organization that are reproducing inequalities and racism. So what is exactly, how can we pinpoint our practices and also start building different practices around promoting racial justice? What to expect? So we have our first online session, which is today. And then very special, we can finally announce that on the 25th of October, we will have an in-person session, a workshop also facilitated by Uma. She will come to the Netherlands in the Black Archives in Amsterdam. And for those who don't know the Black Archives, this is really an important institute that is promoting literature and history around or I would say overshadowed histories of, for example, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the Netherlands, but also beyond that. And they are really facilitating a space for BIPOC leadership in the Netherlands. It's a really important place to be, and I'm very happy that we can actually start this in-person workshop at this location, because that means a lot to build actually these connections and contextualize it as well in the context of the Netherlands. There will also be a walk-in session, basically to have an open space to also share about our experiences and maybe, well, sensitive conversations, because this is really one of those topics that requires a lot of introspection. So we will announce another moment where we have the space to just talk and come together with any questions or any reflections you might want to share with your co-workers here. That is just a very brief introduction from my end. I believe that we can now move on to Uma. Would you like to introduce yourself, Uma?
Thank you so much, DJ, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you all today. I wonder, just so, we have a little bit of space setting, if you all can take a moment to just pop in the chat whereabouts you're calling in from this morning, and just having an addition of just like a note of welcome, like, I'm having my cup of coffee, which I very much am this morning, which is right next to me. So if you can just pop in the chat so we can meet each other as much as possible, that would be grand. My name is Uma. My pronouns are she, her. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland, and that is where I'm calling in from. In my day job, I am a senior consultant with a Better Org and work very much on organizational development and strategy around racial equity, anti-racism within organizations. I am also the volunteer facilitator and the initiator of the Racial Equity Index. And this is the capacity in which I am here today. But all of my work intersects in many, many ways across the board. The Racial Equity Index, for those that don't know about us, is a group of Black and people of color that are all global development practitioners, globally located. We have over 50 years of experience within the global development sector, and all of us have experienced racism in global development. We gathered together starting actually in February of 2020, and then publicly launched in late 2020, when all of the ruptures happened in global development, prompted by the murder of George Floyd. And we gathered together primarily because at that time and this time, there still continues to be very little accountability or transparency around racial equity in global development. So we are creating the first ever and seminal index on racial equity and global development. And you will be hearing more from us later this year. We are going to be releasing our first ever pulse check for the sector that will be an annual kind of way to continue mapping the progress on racial equity within the global development sector. So please stay tuned for that. There's a lot of work that has gone into that. All of our work is peer reviewed. Our peer reviewers are housed in the global majority. And we understand that the contextualization of racial equity across the global development sector needs time and space, right? The definitions of racial equity are not similar, right, across contexts and landscapes. But we are starting from a starting point that we have been working with for around 2 years with all of the research that we have gathered. So we are really, really appreciative to Partos, to Gigi and the team for being able to host us so that we can also not only share our work and share our learnings, but also work with you all in having a very open conversation around the challenges that you are facing in terms of operationalizing and working with racial equity within your organizations. Thank you so much, Sammy and Brittany and Nicolette, for sharing where you are calling in from. And it's also just nice to read where people are working and what work they are leading as well. So please continue to do this in the chat. So the way the session will run today is very, very conversational and very participatory because this is definitely a practice space, and the 25th of October will continue to be a practice space for everyone, right? Because when we're talking about anti-racism and doing the work of anti-racism, it is indeed a practice. We have to be able to wrestle with things internally, individually, communally, to be able to understand what progress is possible or not in this context. So we're going to start, I'm going to start actually with a question on Mentimeter, and we're going to have questions throughout this conversation on Mentimeter, but I want to start with this one question first. And then what we'll do is go into a more somatic grounding. I'll talk about somatics as it relates to racial equity work and why it's so vitally important. And then we're going to move through a conversation around what the biggest challenges for you and your organization have been in terms of actually operationalizing DEI and racial equity, and then how your racial equity work fits in or doesn't with other work streams focused on systemic oppressions within your organization. And then also, what does it mean to do the work of racial equity within the context of this sector, the global development sector? Does that sound good for everybody? Yeah? All right. So a very practical conversation, but also hopefully an embodied one. So an in your body conversation. I should note that I am a somatic and embodiment practitioner as it relates to racial justice and racial equity. I facilitate a lot of conversations around racial justice from an embodied space because it is deeply vital that we are in our bodies as we're talking about doing this work. And there are many reasons for this, some of which will come up today, but some which will definitely come up on the 25th. So I'm hoping that I can see you there. I'm going to share a link in the chat. Please head over to this link so that we can, I'm just going to share my screen so you all can see this. So you can all vote on this first question. How would you rate your progress on your own personal journey on anti-racism, your organization's journey on anti-racism, and the sector's journey on anti-racism? So I'm going to give you all a couple of minutes to submit your votes to this. Very interesting. Can everybody give me a virtual thumbs up when you have voted? You can do this either by your actual thumb or by a Zoom thumb. Lovely. Okay. Great. So we still have some responses coming in, but we can see here something that I think is very, very interesting, but I don't want to just add my opinion in here. How does this land seeing these numbers? So the own personal journey on anti-racism, we're towards the amazing progress side, around 3.7 out of 5. Organization's journey on anti-racism, much less, 2.1. And then the sector's journey on anti-racism is in the same place. How does this land for everybody? You can either pop this in the chat, your response in the chat, or unmute and feel free to share.
I think it's not so surprising in the sense that the people who are in the call are those who are already relatively advanced, because that's also why we are so interested that we want to make time for it and we want to grow further into it. For myself, I don't know exactly how far we are in the sector. And for my organization, Uma, we currently have this week mandatory sessions on power, privilege, and racism. So perhaps I could move it a bit further, but it's just a quarter, half, 3/4, and whole. And I would say it's a quarter and not much further than that. I think we are growing in the right direction, and Uma is part of a large organization. We have a sister organization affiliates that are much further than we are, and we are further on other aspects. But yeah, I don't think that I think we have a big leap to make still, because especially of the privilege and racism part, which is we think we know and we don't. That's also why I didn't rate myself so high. I'm a white privileged person from the global north, so I can't put it as amazing, I think.
Okay, thank you so much for your candor, Nicola, and for sharing. Does anyone else want to respond to how this slide lands, and the responses to it land with you?
I would like to say something. Being a person of color, can you hear me? Yeah. Being a person of color, of course, is not a luxury and queer, not a luxury for to do something with that for my own journey. So I put my own score high on the first one, but then working with white organizations in the Netherlands, it's a bit awkward when you have to put racism on the agenda, being a person of color. So can you imagine a bit the uncomfortableness sometimes when when you're in a white team and you say, okay, let's talk about racism. So it's like, okay. So yes, the score on the second and the third is lower. I think within the queer organization, if I look at the third one, now since Black Pride has been announced in the Netherlands, you know, they wanted to have their own pride, because the regular mainstream white pride was not, you know, they couldn't see themselves in that, and didn't feel acknowledged. So, but it's very uncomfortable to talk still at the moment, you know, about, you know, I think 3-4 years later, it's still uncomfortable. We talk about diversity, we talk about inclusion, we talk about intersectionality, but when you talk about racism, it's another thing. Because it becomes, it can become very personal, even with professionals. So yes, so I was not very surprised by the first one being high and the second and the third being low.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rohit, and sharing also your experiences. I am definitely going to come back to one thing that you have said, but I also want to just ask if anyone else wants to share a reflection on how these results are landing for you in this moment.
Yeah, maybe I can share. Wait, let me.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Is Jennifer first?
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so for me, I really resonate with what was just mentioned. Also, as a person of color, I'm not surprised about this outcome at all. And I feel like my own personal journey on anti-racism really came from far, from, you know, growing up with only white people when I was younger and not understanding anything and being super confused and not knowing how to stand up for myself when racism happened, to I think where I am now. I think huge progress. But I think, and I think in my organization, Choice for Youth and Sexuality, I think everyone has like similar values, like intersectional feminist. But I can tell that it's not, in terms of anti-racism, not everybody feels it in the same way, I think. And I feel like it's sometimes indeed uncomfortable when it's like up to me to be like, oh, let's put anti-racism on the agenda again. I feel like it's not as obvious for everyone. I think it's also because we want to do so much. But I think this is not necessarily something that's on the top of our agenda. And I also feel like with Black Lives Matter, it was when that was closer in time, it was very obvious. And now I feel like the enthusiasm of DEI and anti-racism is dying down a little bit. We still think, oh, it's super important, but I'm also struggling, for example, to even get budget for our DEI working group that we have. Well, we had it at one point, and now it's not a priority anymore. So, I definitely rated it lower for the organization and the sector. But yeah, I completely resonate with what was said before.
Thank you so much, Sammy, for sharing. We are certainly going to return to some of the things that you also shared that also mirrored what Rohit was sharing as well. But Sally, please do go ahead. And there was Jennifer, did you also want to share?
Oh, I just wanted to comment quickly that I was actually surprised that people rated themselves so highly on the personal journey. But I guess it depends also who is in the room. And I mean, I can imagine that people of color would rate themselves higher because of their experiences. I rated myself quite low because I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, are you anti-racist? I would have said for sure. But actually now reading and trying to understand the dialogue, I'm not sure anymore. You know, I'm not sure how much progress I've made, and I would like to explore that myself personally. But I will say this, that even though the sector isn't maybe doing so great on anti-racism, it is amazing that it has actually made the progress that it has made in a sense. I mean, I've kind of been around the block. I'm 54, and I remember even when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs never hired anybody who wasn't a young blonde woman with blue eyes. And that has certainly changed. I know that's small progress, but it's at least something. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting, you know, looking at it with the long view. Things are changing, but of course, anti-racism versus just not being racist is a different type of issue, I think. And that's also why I'm not sure where I am in my own journey, and I'd like to understand that better. So I hope I will learn from this process. Anyway, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for sharing, Jennifer. Sally?
I want to just comment on Rohit and Sammy. Thank you for sharing your story. And I think we saw exactly the same in our organization. So we have a group which is called United, which are mostly people from a more diverse background. And they shared the same thing. They said, yeah, I'm so tired of always being the one having to step up. So for this week, Diversity Week, we organize the training for all the staff focusing on bystander effect? And what is your role just as a person to react for someone else? So, but just to share that the same comments you give was also felt within HFONS.
Thank you for sharing, Sally. I want to offer some reflections, if I may, just on what was shared. Again, I'm noting that every single day I'm facilitating in some way conversations rooted in somatic and embodied approaches to racial justice and racial equity. So I will always bring it back to the body. I will always contextualize what we are talking about back to the body. I wonder if we can just hold space in this moment for the reality of what we are hearing in terms of the fact that Black and people of color still bear an enormous burden and responsibility in even putting anti-racist work and DEI work on the agenda. So in 2023, in October of 2023, that is what we are still saying, that Black and people of color still bear an enormous responsibility and burden in even putting DEI on the agenda. I'm going to go further. They bear that responsibility, but somehow we're saying that our own personal journey on anti-racism is a little bit higher, but for some reason we don't make the link of that burden inherently being violent to people, to Black and people of color. My point in bringing this up, right, and what I said at the very beginning is that this work has to be embodied work. Because if we think about the fact that progress looks a certain way in a policy, in a practice, in a structure, but we don't actually understand what the psychological and emotional impact of that burden inherently is for Black and people of color, we are missing the point of anti-racism work. We are missing the point of anti-racism work if we do not understand that our starting point relies on ongoing violence to Black and people of color for raising and putting DEI and anti-racism on the agenda. So, how does that land for people? Where does that land?
I would like, can I chime in?
Yeah.
I feel, as you were speaking, I said, I feel so seen, because that's, I think, something that me in particular, I have to, I kind of struggle with, right? So putting it on the agenda, and then am I the Black person making race an issue, but it's really not an issue? Those kinds of questions come up, and it becomes a bit more difficult to feel comfortable in a space that is not really safe, but like performatively safe. So I appreciate you saying that, and I just feel like, that's something that me in particular, and probably also other people of color, really value in hearing and being seen in that regard.
Thanks for sharing, Brittany. Anyone else want to reflect on, one, where your body is in this moment? Especially, I'm going to invite, right? When I say that this work is embodied work, I mean this for everybody, for white bodies, for Black bodies, for brown bodies, right? Where is your body in this moment? What are you feeling? If you were to name it, can you speak that word out loud to the air in the room? What are you feeling in this moment, and where is it landing in your body? In hearing what Brittany has shared, and hearing the reflection that I've offered. You can either type it in the chat or unmute and share. Thank you for sharing, Nicolette. Thank you for sharing, Sally. Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Laura and Gigi. and Hannah and Rohit. Thank you for sharing. I'm not sure what your first name is.
It's Bernadette.
Bernadette, thank you. Yeah. So we're going to just stay here for a moment and do a little bit of somatic work because we need to acknowledge what is in the room. And in order to progress in this conversation, and this also, if you are coming on the 25th, we will be doing a lot of this work in terms of somatic grounding throughout the time that we are together. But turn your cameras off for this so that you have space with yourself to be with yourself in this moment. And we're going to just go through a little bit of an orientation exercise so that we can just sit with what has come up in this room and emerged in the room. And Jennifer, I'm going to come back to you after we do this practice. So what I want you all to do, right, I'm just going to read some of what has been shared in the chat. And as I am reading what has been shared in the chat, I want you just to adopt a place that feels comfortable for you in your chair, in your seat, if you're standing, that feels grounded for you in your feet, right? You can lean back. And as I'm reading through what has been shared, all I want you to do is to not be in your brain in this moment. So don't try to cognate, don't try to understand, don't try to dissect what has been shared. Just allow it to land with you in this moment, right? What we shared, sorry, what was shared in terms of what Brittany and myself offered as observations is the inherent violence that is held, ingested, and inflicted upon Black and people of color by even having to put DEI on the agenda. And what people have said in response to this in terms of what they are hearing is the following: that they are feeling acknowledged hearing this, that they are feeling tremendously uncomfortable, that they are feeling sad, that the word performative resonates, that they are feeling angry that we haven't been able to do better, that they are feeling relieved, emotional, and in their heart space, that they are feeling pain, that they are feeling empathy because they too are an individual from a marginalized population, that they feel performative and uncomfortable, and that they feel distant. Whenever you feel available to do so, just take a deep breath and exhale. And take another deep breath. And this time as you exhale, you can open your mouth a little bit and go, ha. And take another deep breath. And do the same thing. Ha. As you are starting just to come back a little bit into your body, one thing I invite you to reflect on in this moment is all of what was shared that is landing with you, and all of what was shared that is sitting with you in this moment. That space is the practice of anti-racism, sitting with all of that. And until we understand that depth and that rootedness of the experience of all of our bodies and the impact of racial violence on all of our bodies, it will never be able to show up in policy or practice or structure or strategy. If you are feeling like it's a bit too much, I invite you just to remind yourself of your edges of your body. So using your hands, and you can just kind of, move up and down your legs, squeeze your arms, and squeeze your hands. You can even touch the back of your head and touch your back. You've got your own back. And then just take a deep breath. And when you're ready, just come back into the room. And if you're open to doing so, come back on camera. And I'll just wait for people to come back slowly. I want to just bring in a piece before we start talking about the organizational piece around racial equity, which is a somatic piece. And Gigi, I'm changing a little bit of the agenda just because of what has arrived in the room. So I hope that's okay. When we are talking about doing this work of anti-racist practice, either individually, collectively, communally, organizationally, as I have said now a few times, it is so, so vital. It is so, so vital that we do this work in an embodied way, right? And one of the things that we talk about as somatic abolitionists and as the practitioner of practice of somatic abolition, apologies, is that racism is about bodies and the experiences that we have in our bodies, right? Two things that were said that really landed with me and struck me is that racism can be personalized, right? But racism is not as obvious for everyone. And it's not, therefore, on top of the agenda for everyone. And then there was another sharing where someone said, we've done this bystander training so that people can act when something happens, when a microaggression happens. But if racism isn't obvious for everyone, and if it's not even at the top of the agenda for everyone, how do we know what we're looking for? How do we know even what racial violence means on not only a physical level, but a psychological level, on an emotional level, on an interpersonal level? How do we know that? Do we know that? Reflections. Type it in the chat, unmute. Do we actually know how racial violence presents in an organizational setting? Do we know that? By omission? Is it safe for people to share? Really great point, Jennifer, right? You're not sure where you are on the journey. It's not always safe for people to share, right? The journey is not linear, definitely not. That is a really, really visible indicator, Rohit, yeah. not getting a permanent contract, not getting leave, not getting benefits, right? Yeah. One of the things that's coming up, tokenism, is a really, really good one, Laura, is that, you know, and I've done this work for quite some time and done a lot of work with a lot of organizations, even in the Netherlands, around their DEI and anti-racism journey. The number of times that I hear, well, I need to see, or I need examples of how microaggressions or what racial violence is in this organization. Why? Why? What is the purpose? And additionally, is that helpful for the people of color in the room, for the Black people in the room? Right? One of the things that I wanted to talk about today, and I am an emergent facilitator, so the agenda that I start with is definitely not the agenda that we end up with. So you all are just going to have to journey with me on this, okay? Is that okay for everyone? Yeah, okay. One of the things that I'm holding at this moment, and Sammy, thank you for sharing this. That is not okay. In terms of being tokenized in that way. But one of the things that I'm holding in this moment is, how do we do DEI and anti-racism work in an organizational context when we do not acknowledge the roots, right? What do I mean when I say that? What are the roots that I'm talking about here? What do you all think the roots are that I'm getting at? Type it in the chat or unmute. What are the roots? The colonial history and position set. Yeah, the systems of oppression that allow racism to go unnoticed and unaddressed, the structures and systems rooted in colonialism, the white saviorism, the colonialism. You all know them. Wonderful. But you all also are practitioners in this space, right? Do your organizations acknowledge them? Yeah. How many of your organizations acknowledge the roots that are inherently embedded within this global development sector? Thumbs up if they do. Oxfam acknowledges it. Okay. I see a few thumbs. Roho, this thing, only talking about it sometimes. That's it. No actions. There's been acknowledgement, but it's on a journey. Acting is a second thing. Right? We know the acknowledgement is there. We've seen statement after statement after statement after statement that organizations, foundations have said, oh my God, our money is bloody. It's built, you know, on colonialism and slavery. But what is evident in this chat is that there is a lot of that and very little follow through and very little action. And it is couched in, we are on a journey. What have you all seen as the evidence of the acknowledgement? What have you visibly seen in your organization of the evidence of the acknowledgement of the systems of oppression that the global development sector and your organization, therefore, is built upon? How is that visible? What actions have been taken? What discussion spaces are there? Has psychological safety increased? What is visible in your organization at this point? So we focus on a lot on decolonizing, but missing the focus on anti-racism, contractual relationships. I'm not sure what's meant by that. Larissa, if you can expand, that would be great. Integrating this perspective in publications, interesting. We have handled all decision-making to the south or the people that the projects are for. Definitely want to talk about this, Sally. Bernadette has shared our project shifting the power to transfer power to partners in the global south. There's attention to diversity in hiring, attempts to address power imbalances in the Make Way program, which Jennifer, you coordinate. Rethinking relationships with partners from the global south, making budget for learning and awareness raising, changing the language that we use. The recent director is BIPOC and genderqueer, signing the 2030 pledge, openness to rethinking the way that we work with organizations in this global south and the language, reference in policies, but much less actual practice and conversations. Focus quite a lot on decolonizing development, but missing the focus on anti-racism, reproducing two top-down approach, challenging ourselves in communication, attention to diversity and hiring. And then signing the diversity charter recently. Started with DEI, different working groups, and rethinking the way that you are working, testing and learning, so that it's more inclusive and no more top-down. How is this landing with everybody, just seeing all of these actions? What do we think about them? Unmute for this one, please. Because it's hard sometimes to keep up in the chat.
I think we're really working hard, but we have also a long way to go. Because acknowledging is one thing, but understanding it, so what you have to do to change the situation, that is, yeah, we still have a long way to go, in my opinion.
What else? What else are we seeing? How are these actions landing in our body? Jennifer.
I think I just posted, it's just scratching the surface, I think. We're not really, I mean, within my organization, we are talking about systems of oppression, mostly economic ones, which are, you know, it's a good place to start for sure, but it's not the whole picture. And I think there's a very poor understanding across the staff of the role of current colonialism. I think very few people are aware of the fact that certain Western countries haven't even pulled out of Africa, for example. They just pretended to have done so. So there's an ignorance, I think, about how colonial relationships continue, even where the actual political and economic system has improved. There's a failure to understand the dynamics from the past. There's also a failure to understand the current dynamics as well. And I think there's also a fear about going into those issues to some extent. And I think that you see that across a lot of people.
When you say dynamics, Jennifer, what do you mean with that word?
Well, for example, I'll give a personal example. I come from a colonial family, partly. My grandfather was in the French military in North Africa, spent 25 years colonizing the North Africans. And there are a lot of belief systems in my family that are very colonial. And those kinds of belief systems, I see them still existing in many contexts. And that's what I mean by the dynamic. So even if you aren't actively, you know, on the ground with your boots on, oppressing people, there's still the belief systems hanging around from generation after generation. And then there's also, for example, just because of the French focus, you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the situation in, like, for example, the coup in Niger and so forth. I mean, France just never pulled out, actually. They just never left. It's just nobody really knows it except a handful of people. But like the French voters have no clue. They don't have a clue about it. But I mean, you know, I don't need to point to all the facts, but I mean, the evidence is all there. They don't even control their own money. And so there's that dynamic, which is a very real kind of political and economic dynamic. And it's very wrapped up as well into the historical past one. So there's this, you know, it's a very confusing kind of situation, but it's still hanging there. And I think colonialism in general is very much embedded in development work. We come out in a way of that, right? I mean, the Christianization efforts and the missions, but also the idea of controlling political systems by, on the one hand, bringing truce, and on the other hand, bringing development. It's not even a secret. Like, you know, the United States government, for example, refers to it as global health diplomacy. in terms of what we do on SRHR. So they're not even hiding it. And so, yeah, I mean, that dynamic is still very much, sorry to use that word again, is very much part of our work, and how do we make sense of what we do.
What I appreciate what you are sharing, Jennifer, I mean, there's a lot in what you shared. And so I want to acknowledge that there's just, even within what you shared within the historical context, there's a bracing that happened, I know, for me in my body, of just hearing certain words. And again, it is not the intention. I want to recognize that, right? You're sharing because I've asked you to share, but there is an inherent bracing that Black and people of color do when we hear certain words, especially linked to historical context. But what I appreciate about what you have shared is that when we use words like dynamics, we need to always go under what we mean by that word, because if we do not, there is such disembodiment in this work. If we don't actually say what is under the word, if we don't actually say what we mean in terms of the roots of what is under the words, we miss the experiencing of what those actual layers of impact have for us as a collective body of people. And the global development sector, as you all know, loves to use certain terminology, but that terminology is used to further disconnect people from the actual violence embedded in the history and the roots, right? So thank you for being open to sharing, Jennifer. Anyone else want to add to how seeing and hearing all of these actions landed with you all?
When I see the list, when I see the list, I think we do a lot of things, but then I start to question, are we doing the right thing?
Are we doing the right thing? Yeah. Laura.
Yeah, I was also thinking that sometimes the terminology that we use is not accessible, and it's those nice concept words, but I feel like sometimes it's not really naming the culprit, or talking about system dynamics and not really getting to the bottom of it. Yeah,
Thank you, Laura. Gigi.
So I observe indeed a lot of focus on understanding historical roots and rootedness of systems of oppression in the development sector. But what I also see, I mean, we're doing a lot, but how much are we actually doing on anti-racism and racial justice? How much explicitly are we dedicating towards that goal? And I think that we can do much more, and definitely can put action to it, because not only in terms of like this thematic work that we're doing right now and this embodiment, which is very important, but also acknowledging that it does require funding, like visibly having a person within your organization that is dedicated to racial justice. How often do we see that? Like, I think I've seen a handful of people in my network that are in that position. And then when they are in that position, they're, faced with so much struggle and resistance. So I wonder where we are standing. And what I added before is like, also feeling at the moment how much emotional effort this takes, how much vulnerability it takes. I just really wonder if we are ready to understand that deeply. So that's my reflection. I think that there is definitely a lot happening around, conversations of decolonization, shifting power. We're comfortable with that, but when it comes to anti-racism, it's I think we're actually trying to deviate and like walk around in a big circle because we don't want to get to that place. But that's my observation and my personal feeling.
Gigi, and this is a question for everybody in the room. Why, when we say the words like racial equity and anti-racism, why do we not want to go there? Why?
So I think like I wouldn't, because I'm at the edge of also breaking emotionally, so that's I wouldn't be able to do that in a very professional environment as well. So that's for me a limitation as well as a person of color. So creating these spaces, which is very rare, I think is also one of the reasons why we're not getting to that level.
Yeah. Thank you, Gigi. I'm going to ask that question again, and I want to hold that for Black people, especially in the room, that there's charge here around this question. So do whatever you need to in this moment. If you need to step away, or turn off your camera, or take a deep breath. But I'm going to ask the question again because it needs to be asked. Why do we not want to go to that place when we say anti-racism and racial equity? Why do our organizations not want to go to that place? What does that mean?
I have found that people feel uncomfortable when you speak about racism because I feel like they see themselves implicated in the system. And so some people are very quick to say, oh, but I'm not a racist. Oh, I'm not racist. And so, you know, to kind of maybe like pacify the situation or not even engage in the conversation. I'm from the US and I'm very kind of aware of my Blackness and my Black body and how I identify. And so this is kind of, you know, generations of kind of knowing like, you know, we're Black and this is what we have to do in society. And so being here in the Netherlands when I first moved here, it kind of felt like people, you know, people don't really talk about racism. And I was really surprised because I'm like, clearly this is, you know, racism exists in this society. But me openly talking about it made people feel very uncomfortable. Even when I kind of went to give a lecture and talking about myself being a Black woman, and people didn't want to even say the word Black because they were unsure of how I would feel about them using that word, even though I self-identify as that. So I think with organizations and individuals, they're just very uncomfortable and they don't want to sit in discomfort. And I think you know this, people do not want to sit in discomfort. And so they kind of, you know, try to find a way to not engage in this dialogue. But I also think it requires for people to reflect on their own behaviors and ideas and kind of come to terms with moments where they have, you know, been racist, you know, engaged in that kind of behavior or witnessed it and didn't do anything. And that also is uncomfortable for some people. But I think, you know, me as a Black person in this society, I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate these conversations, even though I tell people I'm very Black. So I will give you all the Blackness that I have, like what it means to me. But some people just aren't prepared or willing to engage in that conversation.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for sharing. I'm going to press again. This is one of those wound points where we're just going to keep on pressing and it's going to be painful. And we're going to sit with the discomfort of it because we have to. We have to. Brittany just shared that anytime she brings up this conversation around racism, around anti-Blackness in her organization or conversations, there is a discomfort, and people are not willing to sit in that uncomfortable space. Why? What does that mean when we actually step into that space? What are we saying when we step into the space that is required? It's required in anti-racist practice to be uncomfortable. What are we saying when we do that? What are we saying when we do that? And what's interesting is that, sorry, go ahead, Sammy. Yeah.
No, I think we're kind of saying that things need to change. And I think that makes people feel uncomfortable and that people feel threatened by this. Like, I think.
But pause, Sammy, pause on that. Why do people feel threatened?
Because I think you have this idea of thinking of it like a pie. Like if you give more power to a certain group of people, then the other group of people thinks they will get less power. I think that's the idea why.
Sammy, be explicit about which group of people you're talking about. So if we give power to,
like, the Black people, people of color,
then
I think for certain white people, it could feel like they will have less power, and they're just more uncomfortable because, yeah, they might need to give up some power.
Yes. So, but Sammy thank you so much, Sammy, for working with me on this one. I appreciate it. I'm going to just go a little bit further. When we first started the Racial Equity Index, one of our peer reviewers said to us, you should probably think about changing the name if you want to raise funding, want to raise money for the Racial Equity Index. I started this conversation by saying that I am the volunteer facilitator, meaning that we do not have substantial funding. What our peer reviewer said, who is a Black woman, said to us is, by saying Racial Equity Index, and I'm going to repeat this again because it's really important and it builds upon what Brittany and Sammy have both said. By saying the Racial Equity Index, we are saying that we care about the experiences of Black people in global development. By saying the Racial Equity Index, we are saying that we care about the experiences of Black people in global development. When we, as a collective body of people, as a collective sector, as a collective body of people in an organization, are uncomfortable and unwilling to stay in the discomfort that is required in anti-racist work, what we are saying is that we know that the systems of oppression are there and they impact Black and people of color in a certain way, but we do not want to acknowledge the dehumanization. We don't want to acknowledge that dehumanization is still happening on our watch, that Black and people of color are still being impacted on our watch, that our practices, our policies, our systems are still dehumanizing Black and people of color on our watch. This is why DEI is what it is, and why the practice of anti-racism and racial equity is so different, and why there is such an unwillingness to go there. Because when we go there, we have to acknowledge that Black people specifically are impacted in a very different way in this entire sector. So to Gigi's point, and to Brittany's point, and to Sammy's point, what does it mean when an organization can't even sit in the discomfort that is required for anti-racist work? So we're out here creating these policies and these practices and bringing in a DEI practitioner and maybe a racial justice person. Is it actually creating the change that is needed? Where are you all right now in your bodies? Type it in the chat if you're open to doing it. Where are you in your bodies in this moment? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do we notice a theme here? Right? Gina, we've got you in this room. You're not alone in that feeling. Yeah. Yeah. When I said at the very beginning of this conversation that this work on anti-racism and racial equity has to be embodied, this is the reason why. This is the reason why. Because if we do this work disembodied and disconnected from the reality of the impact that racial violence has on Black and people of color, we're not actually doing anything that will change the situation. We are not doing anything that will change the situation. We can talk about decolonization and shifting the power, but if we don't understand how the power structures themselves inherently are so violent, what do we know then to change? What do we actually shift then? Everybody take a deep breath. And just get a little bit of movement in your seat. Because we need to move, otherwise we will freeze and be stuck. And that's not good. So if you find yourself literally like frozen, seriously move. You know, like you can get up, you can stretch, just move your body. I want to bring in this conversation because we've been talking about what some of the barriers are to doing this work, the lack of rootedness actually in the work, the not naming the thing that needs to be named, using these terms that are so disconnected, that don't actually address and bring forward the roots of the issue, right? I want to bring in this piece, especially for the white folks in this room. A lot of times when we're talking about anti-racism and racial equity work, the response of white folks in a room will either be two things: frozen, or what do I do? How do I address this? What is the action that I take? Right? Because both of those are disembodied responses. To be in between the free state and the action state is the work that so many white folks need to be able to dive into, right? Because action isn't going to help right now, right? And the freezing doesn't help either. This being in the discomfort and the energy that's there, even though it feels really, excuse my language, shitty, that's the work. That's the work. And that's hard work, because how do you do that in an organizational context? What does that look like, right? How do you do this work that we're doing, which is the practice, in an organizational context, right? So much of the work around anti-racism requires what I love to say is just slow it down. We need, because what we have seen, all of the things that you named in terms of the actions that have been taken, right? We're shifting the power, decolonizing, we're bringing in people, right? Those are really great action steps. We're just, again, in this urgency culture, we got to fix it, we got to fix it, we got to fix it. But how old is a thing that we are trying to fix? How many decades and decades and decades and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years back does this issue go? Does this problem go? Do these roots go? And so we think that a policy is going to change this? Nah, no, people, no. We have to slow this work down. This is the work of like, what does this mean that we're sitting in this moment of discomfort? Right? Can we understand, right? So one question I want to ask you right now is, how do you see these structures that are rooted in white supremacy? So urgency culture in your organization, power hoarding within your organization, lack of diversity in your organization. How do you see this actually impacting all bodies in the organization? So how do the roots of white supremacy and colonialism actually show up in your organization? I'm going to ask that question just give me 30 seconds because I do want to ask it and kind of gather your responses. So give me 30 seconds to note this. All right, I've put this up on Mentimeter, y'all, and I'm gonna invite you all just to record your responses here, and then we're gonna talk about them. And here is the link again for those of you who don't have it. So how do the roots of colonialism and white supremacy show up in your organization? Mhm. Mhm. What else? Mhm. Wow. Mm. What else? Mhm. Mm. Mhm. Mhm. As you are seeing all of this, how is this landing for you all? What are your initial responses? What is emerging for you as you are seeing this? What are we thinking as we're seeing this? What's emerging for you?
I mean, for me, it just shows like how widespread it is because everyone has examples and they're not encouraging at all. So yeah, it's just everywhere. And I think that can feel overwhelming.
Thank you, Laura. Nicolette.
And it is so totally systemic and it is so deep. And I have no clue how deep it goes, but it's deep. And it has everything to do with power, and we're not aware how that touches our power. I mean, I've had a meeting with the board of supervisors and had to explain this. They challenged me and said, what changes will it mean if we work with equal partnership, meaning decolonial partnership? And I said, well, we will go down enormously in size. We will have much less budget because we have to share that. No, we don't think so. And then I said, oh my God, where do I go? As an example. And it's not all people have, but I got those responses as well. And I thought, no, boy, it will take us so long still.
It will take us so long still. Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Nicolette. What else? What else is emerging as you are reading this?
Yeah, I agree with what has been said before, and also with regard to the development sector, it gives me feelings of frustration, and it's kind of depressed, or like, yeah, it's very frustrating, I think, even working in this sector, because you feel like everything we do is like colonial in itself. And yeah, I have that usually also quite often throughout my day, that I'm like, what are we actually contributing? Are we actually helping anything? Like me looking at this work plan for this program, like what is actually are we even helping? So it gives me a bit of like frustrating feelings of like, how can we even help out, and aren't we just making it worse or something? Or like, how can we improve what we're doing and make it more meaningful, to contribute to decolonizing efforts?
Mm, mm, mm. Thank you for sharing, Sammy. What else for people is landing with you as you see this?
I think it's maybe also uncomfortable, because when I think of myself and my position and working in an eco-feminist organization, if let's say I were to compare myself to the CEO of Shell, I would, very honestly, I would think of myself with maybe a higher moral compass, or, like that I'm trying to do good in this world, and it's not only in my personal life, but also in my professional life. And I think it's the discomfort that you get from realizing all this, and how unconsciously you might be perpetrating things that are so harmful, and the violence, it's very confronting. I think it hits you in a deep spot of, like your ethics,
Thank you for sharing. Laura, any other folks want to share or add to this conversation, or this part in the conversation?
I read this and I just become angry. This makes me very angry that in 2023, this is where we are. I mean, my parents had to deal with this, my grandparents had to deal with this, and I have to deal with this now. And it becomes very frustrating that this is still an issue. Why decision-making is coming up even in my own organization. There are no people of color making decisions in a management level, right? When I started, I was the first person of color in my position. And that was the most senior position when I started. And I'm not a senior person at all, but it's just frustrating. I see this and I get very angry. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like I don't know, what to do, because the people who make decisions also, have made certain comments to me that I felt were racist. So where do I go? What do I do? Yeah, it just leaves me a bit confused and also angry.
Brittany, that's a lot. That's a lot. I would love to connect with you afterwards, if that's okay, just so you and I can have a chat, because I do want to follow up on a more personal level. There's so much exhaustion that I'm experiencing reading this, because this is also my field on an everyday level, and working with many, many organizations, and also doing this work in the Racial Equity Index, trying to demand accountability in the sector around some of these issues. Is there a common root besides white supremacy and colonialism that is perpetuating the fact that we're in 2023 and we're still doing this? Is there something that is woven through here? There's actually one word I'm looking for specifically that is on here, that is connected to what I've also shared previously. Like, why are we still doing some of the things we're doing besides white supremacy and colonialism? I'm looking specifically for one tool of white supremacy that keeps us here. To dominate. Has to do with disconnection. I'll say it in a minute if I'm not being obvious. Maybe. I'm going to go to this one. That. How does this fit into everything else we've been talking about today? How does, especially the first word, fit into everything we have been talking about today? What does that do? What does urgency do? Hannah, yeah. Change takes time, and urgency excludes people, and also what?
But urgency focus also on solutions instead of really diving deep into it.
Run, run, run away. Yes. Yeah. A way of dealing with the real cause. Yeah. Sets an agenda and priorities. Yeah. White supremacy culture loves their agenda and their priorities and their KPIs and all of their capitalistic measurement tools, right? We can't do that when it comes to anti-racist work. There are no KPIs here except the thriving of Black people, right? But urgency, in the largest way possible, disconnects people, right? Because if we just keep people going and going and going in this wheel of capitalism to produce and produce and produce and produce and to not feel and feel and feel and feel, then we can keep reifying systems of oppression over and over and over again, and people won't notice because it's just part and parcel of the process, right? But if we pause and we slow down and we look at the roots, then we have to talk about all the shit that's within that. I swear a lot, by the way. Apologies if that offends anybody. Gigi, you had mentioned earlier that, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but like, what is it going to take for us to do this real work of racial equity and anti-racism, you know? And some others have also said the talk about actually the capacity of racial equity and racial justice work, the funding around racial equity and racial justice work, the space and the time of racial equity and racial justice work, right? How do you get your organizations to even start there? To even understand that that is a starting point, that it needs to be so incredibly well resourced and given the space to even discern what changes may be needed on a deep-rooted level within the organization and the pacing of those changes. How do you get these organizations that are rooted in these systems that are upheld by the same people, that are perpetuating violent systems, to listen? How are we going to do that, y'all? And I want the white folks in the room to respond to this question first. How are we going to do that? That was a good breath, Rohit, by the way. You don't have to respond, but that was a good breath.
I think one of the ways, and sorry for joining late, but I had another work with Asia, and otherwise it's too late there. is by continuing. I always try to call myself within certain situations like a flea in a jacket. So it's that constant itching, that constant questioning, the constant bringing in of why are things done this way? Why do we continue doing this? Why would we need a new tool? Why do we want to bring capacity strengthening instead of more peer-to-peer sharing, etc.? And I think for me, that is one of the ways I see to go, just continue, as well as inner, of course. It's never only outer work, it's also a constant inner itching of what do I do? How does that work out? How does that leave others? So it's always, I think, the inner and the outer work together.
So important, Inez. And I love your analogy being the flea in the jacket or the mosquito, or pick an insect that's annoying. What I so deeply appreciate is this, what you named, which is so needed, the constant questioning, right? Because again, urgency culture does not give us the space to actually question, right? To start to poke holes in why things are done this way. Why are systems built in this way? Why is this policy built in this way? Why has this structure been reinforced in this way? Why is the power system this way? The constant asking of questions is so vital to this process because it slows us down, because we have to respond to them. We have to answer them. What else? How do we get this work resourced? How do we give it the space that it needs in the organization? How do we get our organizations to care? Still, go ahead, Sally.
What I also am realizing is that, we're talking really about actually trauma, and a trauma needs healing, and you need to go deep. So you need, and sometimes it feels like in a professional world, this is the thing that you do at home, healing together and talking. And I think that also needs to change, because you need to have, like what we're talking about, this feeling of uncomfortableness. You need to experience that, because from there you can move forward. So and that for me is a question also, because it's often like the professional settings that don't create that space to just have that openness, instead of going in like, okay, this is the problem, this is how we're going to solve it, and we're going to move forward. So it is, I think, also just having open space to just dive into it together, and without having an outcome at the end of the meeting, but just giving it time. And then the other thing, what for me is very, because I also gave that in the examples earlier on, so we have an HR policy to hire like not only people of color or Black people, but like really a diverse group of people. And then these people are hired and then they leave. And it also really has to do with how we promote people, but also how we we have a measurement of to see how a person is doing professionally well, and that's is really based on such a Dutch standard. So everybody who brings something completely different, it cannot even be measured in this system. So for me, that's also something really important. Like, okay, it's not about HR policy, getting people in, but really about how we all together make sure that people feel at home in an organization and stay and have a voice to change some of the like really systems that are within the organization. So, I mean, I'm talking a lot and I don't see the solution, but there is a lot.
Yeah, there is a lot, Sally. And what I want to just reflect back in terms of what you shared, which was really, really just so wonderfully said, is you're essentially speaking to bringing the humanness back into this work, right? Because capitalism effectively and white supremacy both are insistent on the dehumanization of people, but primarily Black people and people of color, right? That is why we are where we are. What would it mean to actually bring the humanness back into our work, to be engaged in an empathetic way, to be able to have these conversations and practice spaces that require such a deep level of vulnerability and psychological safety? What would that mean, right? And what would that look like? What else? What else?
Well, I think there's something about language that we've all become part of. It was mentioned several times on the, whatever you call that thing. Let me check what it's called. The Mentimeter. And I put there about abbreviations, which for me is again the urgency. We don't take even time to write or pronounce the word people or person. And the whole language that we all use, and as organizations very often also bring into the other cultures and the other countries, and then there's that adaptation towards our language instead of us listening to the language used. Yeah, I think language is a very, very strong part of what makes us stick into the way we do things instead of move beyond it.
Language is definitely an important piece of this, Inez. We, however, need to be really careful in terms of ensuring that there is space for the fluidity and the adaptation of language as it makes sense for the people utilizing the language, right? Not for the dominant culture within an organization or within a context, right? So an abbreviation for me and within this work is okay, as long as it's okay as it's used by the people that are impacted by the issues, right? And then when it needs to change and if it needs to change, then we will adapt it then, right? But it always has to be this very fluid and emergent part of this process. Yeah, Laura, I saw you unmute as well.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent that would apply, but yesterday I had a conversation with a colleague and we're talking about how we are gender champions on a project we work on, and sometimes we encounter resistance from the other people. And I was saying, I feel like because I've done this work of awareness raising and educating myself to feminism, now it's just I have those feminist glasses on all the time and I cannot unsee. I just, everything I'm thinking about, like the smallest thing with that perspective. Every time I watch a movie, I'm like doing the Bechdel test in my head, and would that be a goal to have like those anti-racist glasses on all the time, and then not only in my personal life but also in my work, I could just really always think about what's at stake here, what's violence, what am I doing.
So this is interesting that you're bringing this up, Laura, and I'm just reflecting. I've been working recently with a feminist organization that has had trouble because, again, systems and rootedness and culture in interlinking their feminist practice with their anti-racist practice. And as a somatic practitioner, I think one of the things that I've been sitting with is that feminism, both are indeed a practice, but the way in which we experience those practices is very different in terms of feminist practice versus anti-racist practice, because anti-racist practice requires a level of somatic experiencing. So I think greatly said, you're able to put your feminist kind of glasses on and view the world through that lens and how patriarchy has impacted the systems and surroundings. With anti-racist practice, however, that is so much more of a somatic embodiment practice that needs to happen. That is not just, it's not possible to just view it if we don't feel it. Because again, if we're just seeing it and we're like, oh, this is racist, but we don't actually go that step further of understanding what that racist incident has meant in terms of the dehumanization of that body and that person, then we are missing the point, right? Because then all of our action will be up here and not down here, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Gigi, you're absolutely right. If your feminism is not anti-racist, then it's not feminist, because feminist practice has to be interlinked with anti-racist practice. I mean, this has been the Combahee River Collective statement is, and that group, literally, we've been talking about the exclusion of Black feminists from the feminist movement since the beginning of the feminist movement, right? And that work still is happening in 2023. We are still having that conversation. Yes. All right. What else? And I have purposely been asking for white folks to respond to this question, but I do want to open it up to the room. What else? And also there's a reason, and I'm wondering if you can ascertain as to why I wanted the white folks to respond to this question of the what else? How do we get our organizations to care? How do we get our organizations, excuse me, to slow down and resource this work? So how do we do that? Yeah, Rohit.
I think in the organizations I have worked, it's if I see BIPOC people, Black and people of color, colleagues, professionals, that usually when we come together and we're in a safe environment, we talk about what we face in the organization. Or when you're in the canteen, you know, in the big meetings with all the, you know, then it's like, you know, nobody talks about it anymore. So I think it's also our responsibility, I think, to bring it out, and not an individual responsibility that I have to say something or you have to say something, but together. I think this collectiveness is very important to be to have that we get when we work in an organization. I'm only talking about the internal side. Huh? I'm not talking about the work we do in the field. But I think because I think this talking about us about organization is an inward process. Mm-hmm. And talking about the communities where we work, that's a different process. And usually, you know, it's all brought together, and I would like to separate that. It's very important. So first look within ourselves as professionals working at the organization and volunteers, of course. And now I was still just recently, I was a diversity officer at the COC Nederland. And what you see that when we're in the project group, usually mainly people of color, you know, they tell what they face because it feels safe. But when we are, you know, as I told you, when we're in a bigger group, the stories are not being told. I think it's very important that we start sharing the stories. So we think of bringing the kind of a storytelling event, you know, and but without the discomfort. That's the challenge, right? Because if I tell my story, then, you know, what we talked about earlier, that it can easily create a discomfort, right? And then I stop because I don't want to make you comfortable. And then you stop asking because you don't want to make me comfortable. So, and that's where we are all the time. So I think it's more like sharing the experiences, telling, you know, and even sometimes going through this uneasiness and going beyond it, because I think there's a lot of to win when we do that. And it's not been done yet fully as an organization, I think. To be honest, I don't see actually any organization doing this on a really sustainable level, you know, really deep with dialogues and telling the stories, sharing the stories, because also white people are sometimes in, you know, in positions which are also not privileged, maybe earning not a lot of money, you know, or facing a lot of problems. So we should only not focus, I think, only on color, but in positions that we can relate to when you also are in a less privileged position, and me, and other way around. So talking about power structures, I think that's very important. Thank you.
I think so, Rohit, I do want to just acknowledge that we're reaching the end of this conversation. We've got about 20 minutes left. I think some of the things that you're speaking to are really vitally important in terms of affinity spaces, right? And I'm not talking about ERG spaces. I'm not talking about groups where Black and people of color are coming together to help fix the organization. That's not what this is, right? Affinity spaces are spaces of practice, of spaces of care, of spaces of communal gathering. And they need to be separated at the very least, by Black staff and then non-Black staff, right? At the very least. And if it is a possibility, then for white staff as well, white and white identifying staff to have their own separate space as well, right? Because we know, and Rohit touched on this, and there's that question that I had asked you all of why did I want the white folks in this room to share first in terms of how we can address these issues. It touches upon something that Rohit said that I wonder if you all picked up on. Why is it that we actually need to commune in this way and be able to share experiences, but not worry about or not have the discomfort enter into the room? Because what happens for Black and people of color automatically when white folks are in the room? What happens to us? What do we do? What's our initial response?
I make myself smaller.
You make yourself.
I usually don't share. It depends on with who I am and if I'm comfortable. But if it's a full group of white people, I tend, to make myself smaller and not share my experiences on racism, unless maybe somebody specifically invites me to, and I feel very comfortable.
Yeah. What else do we do?
First thing is to see if it's safe to open your mouth. Really, the first thing. And if you feel slightly unsafeness, you probably, or I'll let me talk about myself. I probably shut my mouth and just wait.
Yeah. One of the biggest things that Black people especially have been conditioned to doing, and this is ancestral conditioning. This is way back. Black and people of color have been conditioned to do is to make white folks feel comfortable at the expense of ourselves completely, right? We make ourselves small. We ensure that, and this is why, by the way, I cannot stand the word white fragility. It's no such thing as fragility. You just refuse to sit in your discomfort, right? But when that fragility shows up, when the tears show up, and we're like, oh, so sorry, we apologize for our own human experience, right? Which is why, Rohit, what you were saying about the affinity spaces are so vital, because Black people, people of color, and white people need to have their own communal spaces so they can understand their own anti-racist practice and experience and how their bodies are moving through a racist system, an inherently racist system, right? Whether it be in the organization, whether it sector, whether it be in their life. We have to have those spaces, right? And these are not spaces where people come together to fix the organization. That is a very different thing. These are spaces so that you can communally gather and talk about experiences without having to make people feel comfortable, one, and two, be seen and be heard, right? Yes, I did. Inez, yeah. So I want to leave 5 minutes for you all to answer this last question. And we're gonna do a little closing practice to end with, but I'm going to give you all 5 minutes to just respond to this question. Okay. And I'm going to play a little bit of music just so as you are responding, you can hear this and go from there. Okay. I think we'll do. Been shared already. There's a lot in this room, y'all. There is a lot in this room. And Sally, yes, please take the time. And this is literally what my advice is going to be to you all. I'm going to close this out 5 minutes early. We're going to just do a 5-minute closing and grounding practice. But I do want you all to actually step away from your computers for about 5 minutes before you rush to a noon meeting or before you rush to lunch, and like stare out the window or go get some fresh air or do something, put some music on and dance to that. Again, I'm going to say what I said at the beginning of this conversation. This is such deep somatic work, this work of anti-racism. It is not just here, and it cannot just be up here, right? We have to be in our bodies as we move through this work. We have to, and this requires this is for every single person, right? White bodies, brown bodies, black bodies. We have to be in our bodies as we move through this work. We have to. I also want to acknowledge that for some of you, the safety in this space may not have been visible today as well because the container was what it was. But we will definitely, as we continue to work with Gigi and Partos, make sure that we build those and construct these spaces so that it feels safe enough and brave enough for the people within it. So allow us to journey with you on that as well. Okay. I'm going to close you all out with a grounding practice. And what I want to acknowledge is that for some of you, it might feel like we haven't closed, like we don't have an answer and I don't know what to do next. And this feels overwhelming and I'm not sure where to go from here. And all of that is okay because you're not meant to know that. Not one individual has the answer to any of these issues. This is a communal process and this is communal work. And it is going to take time, right? So if you are feeling like, if you are leaving this space feeling like, I don't know what to do next, the only thing you need to do is to just take a moment to return back to your body. That's it. There's nothing to solve here. It's just returning to yourself. And we'll gather again, 25th of October. Gigi will send out the details, Gigi and the Partos team. And I look forward to seeing you all in person so we can do this practice in person together, right? And continuing this work with you all. But I want to thank you all for all of your candor and your vulnerability and your honesty and your presence and your intentionality in sitting with what this work requires. Okay. So with that, shut off your cameras. We're just going to do a little bit of orientation just to get ourselves back into our bodies and into the room. So if you're standing, finding your feet in a rooted and grounded way. If you're sitting, just making yourself a little bit comfortable. Just starting to get some movement back into your body. You can rock. You can just start to feel your arms almost giving yourself a hug, just reminding yourself of the edges of your skin, of your hands, of your head, the back of you. Literally, I love doing this and saying, I've got my own back, right? Reminding ourselves that we've got something back here too. And then just using your hands and just moving them up and down your legs. Breathing as you do this, taking in full and deep and gentle breaths. As you just remind yourself that you are here in this body, in this space, in this time, in this moment. And then when you're ready, what I want you to do is just kind of be a little bit still. You can still rock. And then I want you to look just straight ahead of you. So not at your computer screen, but just straight ahead of you. And notice what is there. If it's a wall, notice what's on the wall. If you have a window ahead of you or in front of you, notice what's outside of the window. And then shift your eyes all the way up. So still looking forward, and go all the way up, going up to the ceiling. And then going all the way down to the ground, still looking in front of you. And now you're going to look to your right. And again, noticing if there's a window there or a door. If there's a window, what's outside of the window. Just letting your gaze soften. And then going all the way up to the right. And then all the way down. And then looking to the left. And again, if there's any doors or windows, just looking out of them, of the windows, noticing what's on the walls, and looking all the way up and all the way down. And then finally, just turning behind you and looking over your right shoulder or left shoulder, just pick one, and looking all the way up and all the way down. And then looking over your other shoulder at what's behind you, and then looking all the way up and all the way down. And then taking a deep breath in, and then just stretching in whatever way feels good to you, and moving from that place. And then exhaling and releasing, sorry, that was yawn. And then taking another deep inhale in whatever way feels good to you. Opening your mouth as you exhale. Doing that one more time, taking a deep inhale. And then opening your mouth, exhaling. All right, y'all. I'm going to invite everyone to just step away from your computers, and then in this next couple of minutes, grab some water, some tea, some coffee, some food. Just nourish yourselves in the next few minutes ahead in whatever way speaks to you, right? Just to get yourself back into your bodies. And thank you all so much for journeying with me today, for being here today, for being in your bodies today, for being uncomfortable today. I truly appreciate the space and the Partos team for setting it up and for practicing with you all. See as many of you as possible on the 25th, but take care of yourselves in the meantime. Bye, everybody. Bye, everyone.